Hello, everyone. Hi. Good evening. Thank you for being here to celebrate the 90th anniversary of the Department of English Language and Literature with us. That's an impressive age, that's right, yes. My name is Phoebe, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student with the department and in the English Literature program, and I'll be moderating the panel later on. But before we do that, there's a few people that I would like to thank, and the first is the Center 42 team for helping us set this place up and also for letting us the space to meet here tonight. And the second is the staff members at the Department of English Language and Literature. A lot of them are still downstairs trying to bring people in, so if we clap, they won't be over here. Maybe we can clap for them later on. So now I would like to pass the mic to two important people, and they'll give their opening addresses. The first is the head of our department, who is also a critical discourse specialist, Associate Professor Michelle Lazar, and the second is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Robbie Goh, who is a specialist in global Anglophone literature and also Christianity in Asia. So first, Associate Professor Lazar.
So thank you, Phoebe, and it's really such a pleasure because I've just met so many people whom I've not seen for a long time, some 20 years, some more, and so it's truly such a pleasure to be here. So on behalf of the Department of English Language and Literature, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Robbie Goh, and also our esteemed guests, many of whom are our alum and former faculty members of the department, current colleagues, and students. I am particularly pleased to welcome several of the department's past heads of department here with us, Emeritus Professor Edwin Thambu, and Profs Anne Pakir, and of course, Professor Robbie Goh, right? And they've helmed the department over the last 2 decades, all of whom contributed their wisdom and dedication in shaping and steering the department. I would also like to acknowledge Prof. Lionel Gwee, who is unable to be present with us this evening, but who sends his warm wishes. And also remember the late Professor John Richardson, my predecessor. Our guests here tonight include former students who now play a significant role in their professional lives in policy making in education, culture, and arts. And we count some of Singapore's most well-known creative writers and producers in our audience tonight. As we celebrate the department's 90th anniversary, allow me to briefly revisit our history. Right? So the study of English language and literature was established in 1928, offered by Raffles College. The college itself was officially opened a year later on 22nd July 1929. The first 3 years there was only one full-time staff, the Johor Professor of English Language and Literature, Mr. E.W. Gillette, M.A. Oxbridge. It was 2 years later that a second lecturer, Mr. G.G. Huff, B.A. Liverpool, was hired from England. In those days, the curriculum for first-year students consisted of a course of lectures that traced the history of English literature from the year 1789. There was also a course of lectures on English language and specifically on composition and prose style and instruction in presse writing. From these humble beginnings, the department has grown over the decades to over 50 staff and faculty today, teaching more than 120 undergraduate and graduate modules each year in English language and linguistics, literature, and theatre. Thousands of students have graduated from our department with majors in English language, literature, and theatre studies. These same students have contributed in invaluable ways to the growth of Singapore's nation-building, identity, and culture. The late Maurice Baker, who became our first Singaporean head of department, in fact, was in diplomatic service. And he had played a critical role in building the newly independent Singapore's relationship with India, Nepal, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So we educate our students in the hope that they will continue to contribute to Singapore's development, nurture its ties with the region, and maintain global aspirations through their important work in education, policy making, research, and in the creative industries. As this is Singapore's bicentennial year, the department thought that it would be fitting to focus on snapshots of research about Singapore. So the first presentation will be on English knowing bilingualism and examines its importance as a core competency for the 21st century world in a plurilingual and heterogeneous nation like Singapore. The second examines the key developments and transformations in literary culture in Singapore and the challenges that contemporary writers face and the responsibility of academic study. The final presentation discusses the relationship between Singapore English and Singapore English language theatre and the role of Singapore English as an authentic language to express ideas, ideals, and ideologies about Singapore. Finally, I want to thank Honorary Fellow Associate Professor Anne Pakir, Associate Professor Robin Loon, Dr. Gwee Lee Sui for leading the panel presentations, and of course to our graduate student, Ms. Phoebe Phua, for moderating the discussion. I would also like to thank our collaborator and partner, Center 42, for their excellent support in the organization of this event. I'm also personally indebted to Ms. Angeline Ang and my admin colleagues for all their hard work behind the scenes. And when Phoebe said just now they're all downstairs still ushering people in, they're basically, I think, still downstairs doing the same, right? So I'd really like to acknowledge all the hard work that they've put in. I sincerely hope that you will all enjoy this evening's discussion and that you will actively engage in the open Q&A session after the presentations. We have refreshments downstairs, and we hope that you will continue your conversations downstairs over makan as well. And please do take some time, if you can, to browse through the department's books and publications display also set up downstairs. So I hope that all of you, former colleagues, alum, and friends of the department will continue to engage in the many activities that the department organizes in the future, and we hope and look forward to welcoming you back on these occasions. So thank you very much. So it is now my great pleasure to pass the time over to Professor Robbie Goh, who is a department colleague as well as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and he's going to share with us some thoughts on this occasion. Professor Goh.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's really very heartening to see so many faces, friends of the department, alumni, former colleagues. It's amazing to see Jonathan Webster, Paru Nihalani, Sushila Varghese, ex-students like Heng Siok Tien, and Paul Tan, Yo Ka Chai, so many other faces as well. It really, I think, speaks to the collegiality, the warmth of this department. More on that anon. Michelle has given a very, very comprehensive account of the history of the department. So what I thought I'd do is just give a more personal sort of journey through the department, through my own personal lenses. I think I'm fairly well equipped to do that, having been a student there, a staff member, head of department, and now, in fact, in the midst of annual reviews, looking at the department's performance as a whole. Yeah, but this will be an unbiased, completely unbiased account. I think the department's significance can be measured in a number of ways. Firstly, in terms of scholarship, it's always been a strong department in language and literature, and then more recently when theatre studies was established. Generally strong in many areas. Don't have time to recount all the research areas that it was strong in, but I think it played a crucial role in thought leadership in 3 areas at least. Yeah? Broadly speaking, in language studies, it was language policy, bilingualism, English in a multicultural context. In literature, we've always been strong in theory, post-colonial studies, new literatures, and of course, theatre studies, had pretty much a lock on critical studies in Singapore theatre, among other areas. Right? And that kind of thought leadership has a great deal of impact, and we still regularly get scholars coming from North American centers, from Britain, wanting to work with our colleagues, particularly in those areas, but in others as well. Right? Another area in which the department famously has contributed much is, of course, in nurturing the pioneers of Singapore literature, particularly in Anglophone poetry. And particularly around the gigantic triumvirate of Edwin Tambo, Lee Tzu Peng, and the late Arthur Yap. It's a pity that Tzu Peng is not here, is she? Yeah. Arthur is here with us in spirit, I trust. Right? But more than just that gigantic triumvirate, which really straddled the world of Singapore Anglophone writing, like three colossi. If you talk to many of the writers, the younger generation who are active today, many of them attribute their inspiration, their influence to these three and to other writers in the department as well. Another area, of course, is in the fact that many of the colleagues in other autonomous universities in Singapore, in fact, in other universities in Hong Kong and elsewhere as well, are products of the department. Yeah, and good to see some of them here this evening as well. The department also is well known for a very, very strong teaching culture. Colleagues who are passionate. And here, the two colossi, Susan Ang and Sunita Abraham, many of you know, of course, yeah. Repeat offenders in winning Outstanding Educator Awards, but also yeah. We are aided by the fact that come to us, eschewing, of course, higher paying disciplines that will give them higher paying careers. All are passionate about their subject as well. So it's a pleasure to teach them, and it's a pleasure to teach that discipline. But we do, I think, have a very, very strong teaching culture. I think now, I can actually say that in all fairness, it is true. The department does very we've made some excellent hires. I look at the younger generation of scholars in the department. It's a pity I don't have time to know you guys better. I know some of you fairly well. The quality is extremely high for those of you hires in the department. Yeah? As just one indicator, we've got one presidential assistant professor in the department and two presidential young professors in the department. Right? The PYP scheme is a much more recent one. Again, this is a kind of very telling indicator. The faculty as a whole has 5 PYPs. This goes on and on. Yeah, but Maker, ambassador. We've also had a PermSec as an alumnus of the department. We've had bank vice president. We've had there were cohorts who actually dominated media core, Straits Times. They all move on to other things as well. Some of the corporates are here, but most of them move on to elsewhere. Theatre Studies has produced giants of TV, stage, and screen, including at least one Crazy Rich Asian that I know of, possibly more. Right? And as I said at the beginning, one remarkable thing about this department that I personally have found is just the degree of collegiality, which is quite significant given that this is a department that offers 3 majors. And of course, it's not without its disciplinary and theoretical quarrels. Over the years, we've had some interesting characters and interesting quarrels as well. But I think despite all that, the department has shown a remarkable degree of collegiality and warmth for each other. And again, it's something which I can say now that I'm now on the other side of the dean's desk, that some other departments also have, but not all. Right, so I do hope to see that kind of collegiality continue. I hope to see I will see my younger colleagues make even greater impact in their areas of research. And I will see our alumni go on to make huge contributions in various aspects of Singapore society. To be objective and to forestall any accusation of bias, I should also point out that there's some things that we could have done. We really could have done more for creative writing as a systematic major, and it's a pity. There are all kinds of reasons why it never really took off. This is not to say that it won't one day, but I think that is a want greatly to be deplored. And any of you out there listening have deep pockets or know people who have deep pockets, because that's one of the main issues. It's expensive to teach creative writing. Just the kind of student-faculty ratio that's required and intensive labor of love that's required there. So that's one big reason as well. Yeah. So in closing, I congratulate the department for being one of the pioneer departments in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, celebrating its 90th anniversary together with the faculty as a whole. Right? I look back fondly on the illustrious alumni, the illustrious colleagues that it has produced, and I look forward to even greater things, particularly from the new alumni and the younger colleagues. Thanks very much.
I'm back. Thank you, Professor Goh and Associate Professor Lazar. I think I will invite the three panelists now to take a seat in front with me, and while they do that, let me introduce them. Their CVs are very long, so do forgive me if I have to read from my notes. So first, I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we have Dr. Gwee Lee Swee, and he's going to be speaking about English literature. Dr. Gwee is a poet, a literary critic, and also a graphic artist. In 1993, he published Singapore's first long-form graphic novel in English, Myth of the Stone, and to date he has 6 volumes of poetry under his belt. 6, is that right? Yes, 6. Dr. Gwee is also a familiar voice in the Singapore cultural scene. He's given a wide range of lectures to a wide range of audiences, and also he's been the editor of several acclaimed literary anthologies. So today he's going to be talking to us about the key developments and transformations in local literary culture, and also telling us a little bit more about writing in a contemporary period. So that's Dr. Gwee. Our second speaker is newly honorary fellow, Associate Professor Anne Pakir, and throughout her career, she's held many, many important positions. For almost a decade, she was the director of, Global Relations? Global Relations at NUS, and until recently, she was Associate Vice President of University and Global Relations. She's also written extensively and continues to write extensively about topics relating to bilingualism and world Englishes. She's recently co-published a book and is working on a new one. Today, Professor Pakir is going to be telling us a little bit more about English knowing bilingualism, which is a term that she coined in 1991. And she's going to be talking about it in relation to its relevance to Singapore's future readiness. So that's Professor Pakir. And last but definitely not least, we have Associate Professor Robin Loon, who represents the Theatre Studies Department. Associate Professor Loon wears many, many hats. He is a theatre academic, a lecturer, a dramaturg, a practicing playwright, and also one of the founding members at Centre 42 here. So he's a hugely influential figure in local theatre culture and local theatre scene, not only because he teaches the foundational modules in the department, so everybody has to pass through him, but also because of his involvement with many incubation programs, such as those at Singapore Arts Festival, Theatre Works, and of course at Centre 42. And Associate Professor Loon is going to talk to us today about the relationship between English language and Singapore English language theatre. And he's going to be telling us specifically why the 1960s and 1980s are key points in local theatre history. So I'm not going to hold it back any further. I invite Dr. Gwee to start us off.
I'd rather have that in the background. It really is great to see a lot of very familiar faces I've not seen like for years and years. And to have you all in one room is pretty scary. It feels like afterlife. I think for some of you, you know me probably as the department's prodigal son. You know, the one that wandered out of the classroom and into the so-called real world of writing. What that just means is that I went from the ivory tower into a hermit's cave. What's the difference, you ask? Well, as a hermit, I can read what I want. As a scholar, if you're doing that, you're not doing it right. Now, this evening, I don't claim to know everything, just what I have read, encountered, and grappled with. My own views on Singapore literature have changed many times. The field was already in flux when I began graduate work in the late 1990s, and when I went back to it, it really is a very different creature. I've put up here pictures of titles just from the last few years alone. to give you a sense of what's going on. Not text I necessarily have read, but to give you a sense, so that, if you feel like, this isn't something that you are familiar with, well, join the club. Well, the concept of Singaporean literature actually began in this university, NUS. It began with the department. This is the department's gift to Singapore, to the world. We don't say this enough. We don't talk about this enough. And by this, I don't just mean that there was nothing before. There was Munshi Abdullah in the 19th century, of course, and Po Ling in the earlier part of the 20th century. There was newspaper writing, there was student writing. And I also don't mean that a lot of Singaporean writers, or the best Singaporean writers for that matter, came from our department, which might have been true at a time, but it hasn't been true for a while. Let's be honest. I mean, what I mean here is that the very concept of Singaporean literature itself, it was conceived here. It was conceived in the department. It was first taught here. It began as something that needed to exist for a number of reasons. Firstly, the perceived work of what today we like to say decolonizing the mind, right? We need that to take us out of a certain mode of thinking, and also, of course, to do nation-building work, to help the country itself feel confident what it can do. So that's one. Another is the necessity of developing literary culture, which is quite distinct from literacy or language competence for young people. There's a need to have something besides just mastering English, right? For people to turn to in different capacities. And thirdly, of course, the necessity of finding through literature our own voice. Now it's a pretty dirty word, canon. A canon for that can speak for us, right? A group of voices that can speak for us, or to borrow Prof. Tambu's phrase from his famous poem, any image of ourselves in the poetry, in the writing that we read. To be sure, the concept of country literature has always been practical, not about aesthetics or literariness per se. It's used to talk about something else or to do something else. I mean, for example, does anyone outside of teaching insist on us having the concept of British literature or American literature? We do well. Contrivance is engineeredness. Lest we treat it too seriously as a real thing. It's not a clear field like Southeast Asian politics or feminist studies. It's not like that. In fact, I had a student recently who notes that, why is it we talk about Singaporean literature as if, or Singlit, like this is the popular term now, as if it's a genre. It's like, oh, what do you read? Horror. What do you read? Comic books. What do you read? Singlit. As if it's a genre by itself. That's a very curious thing to note. I wonder if having come to this concept too soon, after others have, but before we had enough writing, creates this oddity. It creates a certainty that we know or can know what Singaporean literature means. But increasingly, this placeholder word doesn't work as we expect it to work anymore. It hasn't for a while now. It's not just literature about Singaporeans. It's not like, for example, something you find in a Catherine Lim's story or Ko Pao Kun play. It's not literature for Singaporeans, like Philip Jeronam novel or Rex Shelley novel. For a long time, I have ran with the idea that it's writing by Singaporeans only, just a very broad category. But that too has grown very tricky. How about those who have left, such as Winnie Poon, Muhammad Latif Muhammad, and the famous Kevin Kwan? Or Malaysians who live among us, like Leong Yu Biok and Dave Chua. And what about the big category today, migrant workers who write here? Are they still part of Singaporean literature, since that they experience this place as well? It is the ambiguous side that we must look at harder now. Even when we talk openly about writing by Singaporeans, there's a falsification here. We generally mean writing in English. We ignore the Chinese, the Malay, the Tamil trajectories, at best gesture to them, and then we assume that they speak and do the same thing. They don't. thanks to growing effort at translation and communication, we know they don't. The Chinese literature still has a strong nation-building interest. The Malay Singlit has a code of religious discourse that is largely absent in English Singlit. Traditional and modern Tamil poetry contest openly. But we bat our eyes to this and then stay unwed. By doing so, we make it easy for those who don't know better to assume our monoculture or the adequacy of English Singlit to speak for everyone. And we let this culture be linked freely to other cultures' literature along new lines or active lines. This, when it should seem more obvious to us, more urgent, and more insightful to link English language Singaporean literature to our own other language literatures. So there's much work for the academic study of Singaporean literature, and the work after decades, I feel, is only just starting to be done. I want to summarize 3 categories for recovery. The first is, I call invisible literature. Works that are published, but for reasons not necessarily related to intrinsic merit, not read, not known, not discussed. I think of Chandra Nair, I think of Said Zahari, Buttigieg. Writing on these people, or the attention given to these people. Second, I think about aborted literature, and this deals with something else that is not necessarily textual. Works that could have come to exist but didn't because of external conditions. And then that also need us to do a different kind of excavation. Why did not this work come into exist? What has happened? Is it a political reason? Is it a social reason? Is it relating to economic problems that a publisher faced? And a third category I would call opaque literature, which is what I already highlighted. Works that cannot be engaged because of their being in another culture, another literature, another language. The flow, by the way, have to work both ways. So far, a lot of work has been done translating from Malay, Tamil, Chinese to English, but how about going the other way as well? Where are the translating of the English works to Tamil literature, to Tamil writing, and all, so that we can have a more proper two-way communication about literary cultures. As you see, all these 3 categories are quite distinct, troubling what we now academically still call Singaporean literature. To be precise then, what needs to happen practically is as follows, and these are suggestions for people who really want to do postgraduate work. Consider doing this for Singlit. First, we really need things that we need to undo in our minds. One, scholars need to face up to what Singaporean literature as a concept has been doing. This is not necessarily judgmental, it is meta-critical. We have to acknowledge who has it helped, this concept of Singaporean lit, and how has it helped these people, and who it hasn't helped, and why it didn't help these people. The second thing is to admit how, in the way Singaporean literature is done, scholars and teachers are complicit in its shape, what it has become. What does this shape mean, and what problems come out of that complicity? And thirdly, scholars have to dare to unlearn what we know as culture against, firstly, a wider here actually. Secondly, a history of literary production. We don't pay attention to that. The concept of merit itself may need to be reassessed, because we seem to have been treating language, for most part, more from out of an English aesthetics than from a less decided multilingual perspective. And that would have demanded something else. If we were to read literature from a multilingual aesthetics, it may well give us a different sense of what is of merit. Second part, things that we ought to do. Firstly, Singaporean literature, we have to really make it a point to say is multilingual. No single department in any university in Singapore so far really teaches all of it, and that must be addressed. Multilingualism implies not just different concerns and styles, but also different trajectories of, in the writing. And second, Singaporean literature needs to be informed by material culture. Professor Ismail Talib, I'm not sure whether he's here, has been alone faithfully chronicling our print life in the Journal of our Commonwealth. literature all these years. But that's not enough, I feel, because there are many more enclaves. What about slam poetry? What about simple remo on the internet? What about Insta poetry? You know, these are all places where literature is being done, and we haven't gone there to study all this yet. And that's on top of the fact that we need different angles and different interpretations on the reality we already know. We also need to study the influence of, we have to acknowledge this, with the influence of publishers, the influence of booksellers, the press, festivals, NAC, prizes, personality cults, all these things on what actually gets written. How these things will actually affect what we'll finally see. I mean, in a roundabout way, it definitely will create that reality. So we need to put a critical distance also, for example, between what writers and others say they are doing and what they are actually doing. You know, sometimes you have to be careful with the things that are put outside as a gender mission. You know, we have to also critically deal with the mission of particular of the press, of publishers and all, and to assess that in relation to what actually happened. And finally, the third part is, I think, something you all agree by now. Singaporean literature has different genres. It has to deal not just with his social-historical fiction or political fiction. We have to think about speculative fiction, romances, children's fiction, experimental writing, biography, creative non-fiction, comics, and e-poetry, among other things. That means we need to not just recover horizontally into the current world, the landscape of the current world, but also vertically into the archives to look back and see what else we can dig out. So I began by saying that I haven't read anything and cannot comment authoritatively, but perhaps my sitting here is really a testimony to the organizers' wisdom, not unlike the Oracle of Delphi, revealing that at least I here know that I don't know. Yeah. but to maintain the concept of Singaporean lit as these departments give, the department will have to help reinvent the concept again now. The shoe no longer fits, and we mustn't hope the toe will go away if we ignore it long enough. Because ignoring creates new ignorance, which cannot be our business as educators. As such, it is with a sense of purpose, not post-colonial distress, that we should consider Singlit, after all these years, still literature in the making. It is still in the making. It hasn't arrived, and it needn't have to arrive. But academically, it has to question its own meaning to this lofty idea we call literature. What does Singaporean literature, I like to leave here as a question, what does it bring to literature? Thank you.
Thank you, Gwee. It is a real delight to be back here with the department, being of the department, and having been, close to the department in all the years that I've been at NUS. I have at least one teacher here, Prof. Edwin Tambu, and I think I am the longest serving after him in the department. So it's lovely because then I see all of you, alum, friends, associates, classmates, as well as former colleagues here. The topic that I was asked to talk about was English knowing bilingualism in Singapore. It has been a topic that has been preying on my mind for a long, long time, ever since I was introduced to a different world in the kind of linguistics that we did in our department. And that was the era of the Katruvian linguistics. Professor Braj B. Katru was invited as a professor to our department by Prof. Edwin Tambu, and it was through him that I learned of this paradigm of world Englishes, and it made us very, very proud to be associated with a paradigm that could give us justification in knowing about our own language and our own language use through English. But this concept of English knowing bilingualism, for me, was defined as, in 1991, in one of my articles, as proficiency in English and a working knowledge in the ethnic mother tongues. And of course, these mother tongue languages, sometimes they are officially known as mother tongue languages. As linguists, you find that a bit puzzling. But anyway, these ethnic mother tongues have been prescribed for the ethnic groups, the Chinese, the Malay, and the Indian. The problem was this idea of English knowing bilingualism. How far have we progressed with it? We have all become English knowing bilinguals. We are products of the system. But then, what are we doing with this issue? And in the context of Singapore today, we are talking about readiness, future readiness. We all recognize that we live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And it's going to get even more VUCA and more violent the way we're looking at geopolitics today. Future readiness, how are we, with a small population of 5.5 million, able to make sure that we will survive, and not only survive, but shine on the global stage? And I think part of this, thank you, has been the fact that we, through the vision, the long-sighted vision of our founding father of modern Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who recognized that English was the language of the investing industrialists, that English was the language that we needed to ensure that Singapore survived. And that, I think, was a vision that looks ahead of its time, because 30 years before English became the global language, the established global language, he had already foreseen the importance of this language. So my abstract, if you have seen it in the brochure, is there up on the slide. In many of our teaching contexts, we tell the audience what we're going to tell them. We tell them, and then we tell them what we've told them. In this particular one, I'm going to ask questions at the end, because I understand that we have a 30-minute session. So, okay, I said this is a population of 5.5, and this was from the Census of Population. I think since we all are of this country, in this country, we are very familiar with this kind of statistics. The important thing, of course, is to understand that within this population of 5.5 million, we have a population of majority group and Malay, Indian, etc. So it brings us back to the question. Bilingualism, in terms of being the cornerstone of Singapore's language policy since 1959, when the PAP got into a position of power. Why? Why was bilingualism a cornerstone? What happened? And how did it happen? So if you remember, having grown up in this community, in this society, in this country, in this nation, we were all products of either English medium schools, Chinese medium schools, Malay medium schools, and so on. And we know that at the time of British colonial administration, the English medium schools were either aided by government or run by government. And a lot of the local vernacular schools had their own, medium of instruction and their own vernacular languages being taught. But apparently, that was at the start of our finding independence, at the start of our becoming a nation. So the reasons were probably to contain the ethnicity problem that could have arisen from this very multilingual, heterogeneous population. And then the problem of nationhood, because at that time, the crucial question was, who cared if Singapore survived? And the leaders of the nation then said, no one cared. And we had to make ourselves relevant. And we had to make ourselves so relevant that others would care if we went down as a country, as a sovereign nation. And eventually, that language policy of bilingualism evolved into English knowing bilingualism. Although originally it was supposed to have been the introduction of English into the Malay medium schools, introduction of English into the Chinese medium school, etc. So for me, the bilingual education policy with English as the working language and the ethnic mother tongues or the mother tongue languages it soon became the cornerstone itself, meaning the bilingual education policy had English as the cornerstone, and then the other languages were compulsory second languages, and the idea was that you could become an English-knowing bilingual. You had to become English-knowing as a population. And so in 1987, those of you who were in school at that time, the medium of instruction became English for all. English for all. That was the Straits Times heading. I remember reading it. The question is, born out of this system, the Singapore's education system, proficiency in English and a working knowledge of one's mother tongue language, is that going to serve us well looking into the future? So prospectively and retrospectively and prospectively, we have to worry about what we're going to do with this. Of course, we know that English has developed in a particular way, and Singapore was lucky because English as a global language became very ascendant in the late 1990s and in these 3 decades or so. And in Singapore, we have this dual orientation towards English, the outward orientation, meaning that we needed to have this global language, we needed to be with this global language for trade, commerce, science, technology, etc. And of course, this outward orientation also meant we had to be intelligible, we had to be sophisticated in addressing the global stage in terms of our standards of proficiency, etc. The domestic orientation towards English was slightly different. We know that it is still a local language for interethnic communication. We know that we have developed discoursal and linguistic features that characterize us as a particular species speaking this language, the local speakers of English in Singapore. And of course, displaying standard as well as non-standard discourses. In yet another publication in the past, I talked about global yet local. In many of the other scholars listed here have also looked at this dual-purpose lingua franca in Singapore. We use it internationally, we use it nationally. The way we use it internationally is quite different from the way we use it nationally. But the problem is, because of the extensive English-knowing bilingualism that has developed over the whole of Singapore, there has been what I see as an ascendant English-knowing bilingual community here, where we are becoming increasingly English-dominant, and we're becoming less and less proficient in our linguistic fluency and our cultural fluency with the ethnic mother tongues. So in terms of another dual orientation, the competing norms, we have, as linguists, looked at the internationally standardized forms for global orientation, but we also have studied the locally indigenized forms for a local orientation. Debates with the extension of entrenchment of English-knowing bilingualism in Singapore have included these bullet points: language maintenance and shift, identity and the transmission of values, equity and meritocracy, as well as local versus global linguistic norms and standards. I'm sure you're aware of all of these issues, these debates. For example, will we ever see the rise of the Chinese vernaculars again in Singapore? The language shift that has taken place to English and to Mandarin among the dominant Chinese community, 76% of us, has meant that the transmission of some of these local dialects that were known as Hokkien, Teochew, are still known as Cantonese, etc. The chances of survival in Singapore may be minimal, but there is a hinterland where you can go back to recover these languages. So there's no real problem. But then other local dialects, perhaps a variety of Malay called Baba Malay, spoken by the Peranakan Chinese, That is definitely in decline. So there is that language endangerment for some of these other local varieties of other languages that are not spoken too much today. Identity and the transmission of values. This was a very big debate when, the papers as well as the political masters were talking about how are we, in terms of values transmission, how are we using languages and which languages? Equity and meritocracy, as you know, in Singapore, we are multilingual, multicultural, and meritocratic. But in this meritocratic system, there would be the possibility of the English-knowing ascendant family being privileged, because a lot of the assessments and the gatekeeping and so on are kept to the cohort that knew English well and used it best. So there would have been that kind of, equitable distribution of a resource such as language, called the English language. So the debates continue unabated, and they will not be debates that will go away, and as new challenges arise. But the main question remains, how do we ensure Singapore's success on the global stage? So one of the debates, I don't have much time to go into it, but you can look at how there are differing perspectives on Singlish, right? However defined. So you have it as a language of interethnic communication and cultural expression. It expresses the voice of Singaporeans. Singlish as the language that subdues the upward mobility of the lower classes is a hindrance to equity. Singlish is bad English, learned in linguistically poor acquisition environments. Singlish as a relatively structurally stable language, another instance of natural language evolution. Singlish as a language in its own right, a subject worthy of academic study. Or I have Gwee's book here, right? Speaking Singlish. And Singlish is an example of local English, which is, globally oriented, but culturally very local. And that is built on the Catruvian paradigm notions of pluricentricity and translingual creativity. So for an example, if you want to know more about Singlish and its being as a controversy, Lionel, our colleague, is not here, but he wrote a very good book, just recently published by Cambridge University Press, on the Singlish controversy. It's about language, culture, and identity in a globalizing world. Now, striking a balance between the global and the local, this is nation building, nationhood, identity making, etc. During our National Day celebrations at the Padang, we sing in 4 languages. We listen to speeches in at least 3 major languages, etc. So it is like as if we are balancing the acts all the time for our relationship with this global language, in the relationship of this global language, English. There's also the balance to be struck between the use of language as a resource or the use of language as an instrument of national cohesion. At a particular point in time, English was seen as a resource, as an instrument for economic pragmatism. But now, it is now possible to think of English as an instrument of national cohesion. Do we cohere as a nation through the use of English? And then balancing between attaining highest levels of English proficiency and maintaining spontaneous everyday interactions in Singlish. And then the balance between developing and established norms in world Englishes. Pluricentric norms and transcultural creativity is very common in the way we use English in Singapore. If you don't believe me, look at what we do in terms of how we order kopi from the kopitiam, or kopi from, some of our food halls, food courts, food malls, whatever. How do we order kopi? When I read this to an international audience, they just shook their heads, and I said, well, at Starbucks, you can do this too, right? You have your black, your long black, your American, whatever. So that's an example of how our English has become localized. And then another example of pluricentric norms and transcultural English. This was at the height of the Zika, outbreak. Min Liao Law, now we know as Singapore. So essentially what I've tried to do in this past 15 minutes was to bring to the forefront our interactions, our relationships with English as a global language, as our local language, as the language for our nation building, as the language for our understanding of each other's cultures, etc. But what more, going forward, a new balance has to be achieved, I think, in our language management in Singapore for us to be future ready. What more can be done to facilitate higher achievements in English knowing bilingualism and biliteracy, biculturalism in Singapore? How important would this be? Yesterday, I was wonderfully treated to a lunch by an artist, a calligrapher, and a philanthropist who was really very interested. She's Chinese, so she's really very interested in getting it very deep into this question of linguistic fluency and bicultural depth of understanding. And she's very interested in a group of 30-year-olds. If you are in this audience, you are candidates, who she said Singapore would have to depend on to really get beyond a working knowledge of their mother tongue languages. They need to get beyond just using these languages for communication in this context, but to use it across the borders, so being very deeply involved in Malay culture, Malay traditions, the Malay language, accessing the Malay mind through the language if you are learning Malay. And similarly, if you're learning Chinese, you cannot compete with the Chinese that are going to come onto the global stage very soon if you do not get into the mind of how the Chinese think, how they use their language, how they write their characters, how they spout their words of wisdom. You have to have more than just a working knowledge of Chinese. You need to have a very deep cultural understanding of Chinese from understanding the language very deeply. With the rise of English as a dominant language spoken in the streets of Singapore, what shape will it take eventually? And I don't think it's unrelated to the question that we raised about Singlit. It's a question that we will keep on asking and wondering about because we have no solution. We don't have the answers. Should we be concerned that the language that we call our own, that we call we call our own, we own it, etc., is different from what would be recognized as a major variety of English on the global stage? Another question, with an ascendant English-knowing bilingual speech community in Singapore, how will the members use English? Will they use it as a commodity, as an index to their identity as Singaporeans and a culture, the multicultural composition of their communities? Will they use it as a tool to gain higher levels of influence on the world stage? So finally, the question, what new balance in language management must be achieved to ensure that Singapore does well on the global stage? Perhaps that's a question that we should all ask ourselves. Maybe linguistic fluency is great, is good, but bicultural fluency is also a very necessary part of the answer. And it's wonderful that we have, for our mother tongue languages, 3 major languages and more, which are so important for our region. And as you know, the gravity of attention, the gravity in higher education has shifted over to this part of the world, the Asia Pacific. And we are poised in a very wonderful position to look at our English knowing bilingualism with a different lens. Not just a working knowledge of mother tongues, ethnic mother tongues or mother tongue languages, but a deep and very linguistic understanding as well as a cultural understanding of these other communities that we will interact with in this VUCA world. Thank you for your kind attention.
So what do I do? No, I need to get to the Bread Sea. Thank you for coming to Center 42. I do apologize. I've just lost my voice. I'm just going to quickly take you through Singapore English Language Theatre and really just to talk about Singapore's relationship with English language and how the colonial tongue has become a lingua franca of its most dominant branch of theatre. Now, unlike in many former colonies, English theatre in Singapore did not fully experience what Awan Amka has described as colonial anxieties and post-colonial desires. So the limited impact of the English language on Singapore could be due to the fact that, and I quote, for most of Singapore's history, English was a minority language used for official purposes such as in government offices and the law courts and mastered by a small elite. While the majority of the population spoke a variety of Chinese, Malay, or Tamil. In fact, as Wendy Broadhurst Heng has pointed out, in 1957, just 1.8% of the population used English as their first language, though, of course, many others were able to speak it to some extent. Indeed, English was not universally and indiscriminately imposed on colonized subjects. English remained a minority elitist language until Singapore's independence. Now, as the language was used in courts and government services during Britain's colonial rule, the language, and I quote, discursively performed itself as modern and as a metonymy of power and authority. Now, however, in the early years of post-colonial Singapore, the English language was not seen as language of the oppressor, a language that should be disavowed or renounced in the recovery of a post-colonial identity. It did not become a site of power contestation in the decolonization of Singapore. In fact, it was readily adopted as the default neutral language of choice in multicultural Singapore. I continue with Broadhurst Heng, and I quote, English was seen as a vital economic resource enabling Singapore to find a viable economic role in the modern world in trade and in commerce, banking, tourism, education, and research. And second, English was seen as a neutral language between the various races, so it could act as a unifying factor, allowing for inter-ethnic communication with no race gaining an unfair advantage, end quote. So English was not only seen as language of commerce, a tool to gain economic power, but also deemed the language that could safeguard multicultural peace among its population. So English has always been seen as a pragmatic language that has dual function of increasing economic prosperity and inter-ethnic stability. So both factors were crucial for the newly independent Singapore to overcome its lack of natural resources, underdeveloped economic machinery. So while the official national language of Singapore remains Malay, English was the de facto lingua franca. Quote, in fact, the promotion of English in Singapore has been so successful that nowadays young people often find that their ethnic tongue, otherwise known as their mother tongue, is the language that they struggle with in school. So the rising importance of the English language in Singapore has a direct impact on the development of English language theatre here. Its use naturally dictates the reach of the populace. David Birch, in 1984, locates the beginning of Singapore English Language Theatre in 1958 with the staging of extracts from Lloyd Fernando's Strangers at the Gate, produced by the University of Malaya in Singapore Drama Society. So, prior to 1958, Singapore English Language Theatre was ghettoized as expatriate entertainment and amateur theatrics. Many groups were set up in the army bases to cater for the British troops. stationed in Singapore. So groups like Changi Theatre Club, Salita Theatre Club, Tengah Theatre Club, Rowcraft Theatre, Naval Base Drama Group were all very active. So other groups performed during this particular period were mostly non-Singaporean groups comprising expatriates, and the most prominent being the Stage Club, formed in 1945. An amateur theatre group still active today and consisting mostly of British and American expatriates in its early days. So Birch, David Birch again, argues that its presence in Singapore theatre is not significant because, quote, what it does and the people who do it could be anywhere in the world and still be exactly the same. Now, I contest that because I think the expatriate associated theatres in Singapore form a very important track in Singapore English language theatre. The Singapore Theatre Repertory Showcase, STARS, is a very good example of how expatriate-associated theatre has a positive impact on Singapore English language theatre. So we go to the beginnings. So the year 1961 saw the establishment of the Experimental Theatre Club. So its founding members, Kiru Joseph, Lim Chor Pi, and a host of other undergraduates, hoping to find a Malayan theatre for social plays. So Birch notes that ETC on paper was committed to interjecting into its attitude a great determination to create a Singapore theatre. So Mimi Fan is credited as the first full-length play written by a Singaporean about Singaporean concerns. It is important to note that in 1962, the concept of an independent Singapore was non-existent. Singapore was conceived by its leaders as part of the Independent Federation of Malaya. While it appeared slightly problematic to classify Mimi Fan and later White Rose at Midnight as Singaporean, they remain exemplars of early playwriting. So I'm going to skip quickly to White Rose at Midnight. So the two plays, Mimi Fan, White Rose at Midnight, they dramatize a kind of alienation that typifies modernity. So in Mimi Fan, the foreign-educated Chan Fei Long is alienated from his country even though he claims that, quote, I've always thought of myself as Malayan. In White Rose at Midnight, the division between the English-educated and the Chinese-educated typifies an emergent modern Singaporean struggle. So this is a reading that was done.
Answer. You don't know your own self.
Do you?
Of course I do. I know my own mind and my own...
Your heart?
Now perhaps we have come to the heart of the matter. Or shall we say the matter of the heart? That's why you don't know yourself.
I think you have been reading too many romantic novels.
So my guess is true? Yes?
No.
Oh, I'm disappointed. Why not? All the English educated think about is romance, the Hollywood type of romance. Well, not everyone has matters relating to the heart to worry about. Is she pretty?
Who?
She.
I've never seen her before.
So I'm going to go on to another pioneering Singaporean, let's go back to here. Another pioneering Singaporean playwright called Goh Po Seng set up the Lotus Club and later Centre 65, which Centre 42 is modeled after, to promote local theatre. So we're going to talk about a play that he wrote that was recently restaged by a young group of Singaporeans called The Moon is Less Bright. So it has been criticized for its, quote, turgidity of syntax and stilted idioms on account of it being incongruous for farmers to speak so impeccably. So in his program notes to the staging of When Smiles Are Done, Goh actually speaks of how it was appropriate for the English educated to speak local English and how the Chinese educated should speak proper English in English theatre. So this experiment with registers, while naive and misconceived, displays a will of the Singaporean playwright to bridge the Chinese-English divide into a single tongue. So When Smiles Are Done, Goh Po Seng takes the drama into the middle-class living room in public housing. So I don't know how much, you probably can't read much of it. English is still not widely spoken. The use of the middle-class public housing environment in an English language play can be read as Goh's attempt to reflect and participate in the realities of Singapore in the early days of its expulsion from Malaysia. So the play's use of the local variety of English, while riddled with idiomatic inconsistency, was a commendable attempt at extending the reach of English on the stage. So I'm going to quickly go and talk about the years between 1962 to 66. It saw the rise of a nascent Singapore English language theatre characterized by a concerted effort of an English-speaking upper-middle-class elite to take its place in a country that did not speak its language. So the alienation faced by this English-speaking middle-class elite is dramatized in some of the plays that I've discussed. As Singapore responded to expulsion from Malaysia, nation building and survival became critical. So between 1966 and 1973, fewer plays were written. I'm going to quickly jump to developments in 1970s. The year 1974 marked a significant milestone in the staging of Are You There, Singapore, written by Robert Yeo. Is Robert here? And produced by the University of Singapore Society. So prior to the Society's concentrated primarily on experimental work in Anglo-American theatre, Yeo's plays depicted a group of foreign-educated Singaporeans in London struggling with their decision on whether to remain in a foreign land or to return to Singapore. So the play concerned with identity in the search of rootedness was presented at the Cultural Centre. Produced and directed by Prem Kumar, the play broke all box office records for a theatre performance in Singapore. Yeo's second play, One Year Back Home, followed the characters from Are You There, Singapore, written in 1979 and only given a public entertainment license and staged in 1980. It criticized the PAP's domination of Singapore politics and played to packed houses at the Developmental Bank of Singapore Auditorium. So again, One Year Back Home proved again that not only was there an audience for locally written English language plays, but the dramatist and the playwright's voice was also growing. I'm going to skip on next to the prize-winning entry for the 1983 competition organized by the Ministry of Culture was a play called Emily of Emerald Hill, written by Stella Kon. Kon's play is a significant milestone for Singapore English language theatre. It's a monodrama. It traces the life of Peranakan matriarch Emily Gan. In the play, she code switches from colloquial English to received pronunciation English to Peranakan patois to depict the different scenarios and characters. So while the structure of the play is problematic and its theatrical devices inconsistent, Emily of Emerald Hill demonstrated a distinctly Singaporean voice in speech and in subject matter. So today, monodramas continue to be an important subgenre in English language theatre. This is Margaret Chan in action.
This is Emerald Hill. This old mansion in a big compound just off Orchard Road. My husband's father, Mr. Gan Eng Swee, built it in 1902. In 1929, I came to live here as a bride of only 14 years of age. Ever since then, I've lived here with Kyong, my husband, our children, and Kyong's parents when they were alive. In the Gan family, there are 6 adults. Kyong and me, his 2 younger brothers, and my sisters-in-law, Susie and Molly. I have Richard, Charles, Edward, and Doris. And Susie and Molly have 6 children between them. And then there are the servants. I need 2 in the kitchen, 2 to wash and clean the house, and then there are the various baby amas and the various personal maids, and the driver and his family living at the quarters at the back, and 3 gardeners and their family too. What do you think? Full house or not? Do you understand what made me what I am? Before my breasts were grown, I learned that a woman is nothing in this world that men have made, except in the roles that men demand of her. Your life is meaningless. You have no value, except as you are a wife and mother.
Many English language plays written in the 80s were monodramas because the form afforded playwrights the space to draw connections between the personal and the political. So examples of 1980s monodrama included Kuo Pao Kun's The Coffin is Too Big for the Hole, No Parking on Odd Days, and Russell Hing's Lest the Demons Get to Me. So Emily of Emerald Hill may be seen as the forerunner of the monodrama subgenre. Now between 1974 and 1984, local adaptation of foreign plays filled the gap left by low input of locally written plays. These foreign plays were Singaporeanized to reflect local concerns. Many of these productions were showcased in the then Ministry of Culture's Drama Festival and Festival of Arts. Notable productions include an adaptation of Peter Nichols' National Health entitled Nurse Angamutu's Romance, 1981, Terry Rex in 1982, Samsing and the Chitia's Daughter, which was an adaptation of the Trepanny Opera in 1982. All three produced by Experimental Theatre Club, which also staged Susan's Birthday Party. These adaptation and locally produced foreign plays in English prepared the Singapore audience for the boom in English language theatre that would start in 1985. Thank you.
So our half an hour of Q&A is now 15 minutes. I think I won't hold it back any further by asking the first question. Are there any pressing questions? Anybody want to start us off? I will also say that there are two mics, and the Center 42 team will bring the mics to you. If you have a question, please speak into the mic because the event is being recorded. Also, the speakers have said that they welcome any kind of question. It doesn't have to be a specialist question or a masterclass, so feel free to speak. Or comments, that's right, or comments as well. Yes, Prof. Bao.
I'm also from the English department, and I'm impressed by the fact that the three speakers all make one very serious grammatical error. Why is it Singapore literature, Singapore English, and Singapore theater instead of Singaporean literature, Singaporean English, and Singaporean theater studies? You don't talk about Britain English, and I hope that probably we don't study Britain literature. I just have there might be some historical reason for that, namely the notion of Singaporean. Here is my real question. Notion of Singaporean, when does that start? Maybe because that very notion didn't exist when the term Singapore English or Singapore literature or Singapore, whatever name that you want to add, came into Y currency. I don't know whether you have any thought on that. I have no historical data to back that as that hunch, but I think that probably is the reason, that the notion of Singaporean didn't exist probably much later.
Can I quickly add that I'm quite sure I said Singaporean literature. Maybe a couple of times I slipped, but I'm quite sure I said Singaporean literature. I'm always quite conscious about that on the simple point that I have many debates about Singapore literature versus Singaporean literature with people. And, you know, depending on who you talk to, they always flip around. Some people say that they are quite distinct. You know, one means literature that are by Singaporeans. The other one is like the literature that you find in Singapore. And I said, oh, all right, okay, but it depends on who you ask, as I said. I mean, and then suddenly the categories flip again, you know, that certain person will say that the other one meant that. So, I don't know, I mean, it goes on forever in this case, but I'm just trying to save myself a bit there. If there's a recording, maybe prove me wrong.
I think you sidestepped it by saying singlet, right? So, I guess so. No. Prof. Pakir and Associate Professor Loon.
Pao, you joined our department in the 1980s, right, Pao? In the 1980s, you joined our department. There was a very lively debate between the sociolinguists in the department, you know, Susan Hunston, Anthea Gupta, Julie Bradshaw, David Birch, David Butt, everybody else. We were discussing this exact same question, you know. Why is it called Singapore English and not Singaporean English? This is among the linguists. Why is it Singapore theatre rather than Singaporean theatre, etc.? And I think one of the, my memory is really vague, but I thought one of the plausible answers at that time was that you hold a Singapore passport, not a Singaporean passport. So on the basis of the country being, you know, what was the exact words that were used? That was so long ago in the 1980s, but it was equivalent to saying, I hold a Singapore passport. The Singapore government. Yeah, and the Singapore government, not a Singaporean government, etc. based on jurisdiction, territory, country as a city, as a nation, as a whatever, you know.
Yeah, but, I think the way Singapore theatre works is that the Singaporean, I think if you put them as two entities side by side, then they have a kind of an equal weightage and an equal, so one is not subservient to the other, one is not belonging to the other.
It reminds me of our song, one of our many National Day songs. We are Singapore, Singaporean.
Anybody want to sing it? Another question? Don't be shy. I actually have a little bit of a follow-up question to Prof. Bao's question. Why is it not Singapore Englishes or Singapore literatures or Singapore theatres? So is there a reason why that's not what you refer to it tonight?
We do use Singapore literatures, Singapore Englishes, and I don't know about Singapore theatres. It's possible.
Okay, so that's the short answer to my question. Any other questions? Feel free. I guess I can ask another question. Or do you have questions or comments to respond to each other's presentations? Well, I'm currently in the department, and I'm so in the thick of it, so I have to read, and all the things that you're talking about are things that I'm also aware of in the current journals and in the debates that are happening now. So what do you think, or in your vision, what is the role of the department in answering all the things that you've brought up today? So one of the things that I thought was very interesting is that there's this kind of restlessness about unseating English as the sort of like dominant mode of discourse, even in the university setting. So what do you think the department's role is moving forward from this?
I guess I could come to this question from an educationist point of view. You know, I also come up with a model called the Expanding Triangles of English Expression in Singapore. And this arose from my spending time with students from the Gifted Education Program, watching them for 3 months using the English language in the classroom. And I thought, wow, you know, using the Hallidian functions of language perspective, I could see that these students were really, of course, they were a special cohort, right? The gifted education group. They could range on the decline of proficiency and decline of formality up and down, depending on the situation, the context of the situation. And it was amazing to see how they would banter and play with their teachers using Singlish. And then that was, you know, because of your book. But they could also, when it came to discussing the great chain of being in the Shakespearean, drama, or to questions of surrogate motherhood, they could discuss this in very formal terms, you know. So I thought, maybe, yes, this is what we could do as educationists, recognize that at the playful level, at the, the level of camaraderie and, and intimacy and solidarity, we would revert to that kind of language that we all grew up with. But at the same time, when it came to having to perform in an academic setting, the students already had a high proficiency in the language. And our job as educationists was to ensure that not only this 1% of the cohort of the cohort enjoying this kind of ability to have the largest triangle of English expression, but to ensure that every student, every child in the school would have this opportunity also. So I guess the role of the English language department in Singapore, as is the role of all English language teachers and teaching institutions in Singapore, is to ensure that our students do acquire the highest levels of proficiency in English for them to be able to range on the formality climb and the proficiency climb as and when the context of situation needed it.
I just want to add, that's also, I think, my point of view when it comes to literature as well. On the simple point that I think we have to go, I think, when we read Singaporean literature, beyond just reading for the English, but having a consciousness of being in a multilingual setting, and therefore the English that is written sometimes would have the inflection of another language, you know, and we have to grow the sensitivity where that is coming from, how then to read the work in relation to it being not just English, but English with the inflection of another language. Now that's one, and secondly, also nature of translation itself means that things will get lost in the process, and we have to gain a way in reading an English translation of another language literature, in that reading, a sensitivity to the missing spaces, to how to reconceive that English as it would have been articulated in that language. So, I mean, I don't know whether translations themselves need to actually beef up. We need to have better and better translations, more proficient, more able to communicate and bring across a correspondence to what was actually said in the original. But until that happens, I think we need to have a body of sensitivity.
So again, I apologize for my voice. I think Singapore theatre Singapore English language theatre has a very specific and slightly different trajectory. It is highly regulated, so there are certain gaps in its historical continuities that are not there. So I think as an academic department or as just a branch of the humanities, we need to fill in the gaps for these discontinuities. So there's certain parts of Singapore's theatre history that has not been in any way, or it's been obscured. So I think those need a certain level of recovery, which I think is one of the reasons why some of my co-founders and I decided to do something like Center 42, is to help recover these particular pieces that are lost and encourage the next generation to re-look at them. I think it's very important that we don't chase after the next big play, that there's a lot in our repertoire. I know we don't like to use the word canon, so I use the word repertoire. The repertoire that we can tap back on and really look at. So the Second Breakfast Company, for example, is an example of a young theatre company that, I don't want to use the word rehabilitate, but they kind of look at old plays and they try to bring it back. So I think that's a very good sign. So the obsession of writing an original play, writing a new play, I think there's a lot to be done in recovering these plays.
Thank you. We have one question, yeah.
Hi, my name's Theophilus, and my question, I wanted to ask the three panelists what you all thought of Prof. Robbie's comments at the start about the room for, or even the dream of, a creative writing program at NUS. Do you think there is such a possibility? And given that NUS would not be the first university to do this in Singapore, how would NUS do it differently?
That's a major question. I'm not going to answer that.
No, I think the best person to answer this question is Professor Edwin Tambu, and he's here. Can we please invite him to make a comment?
Do we have a mic? Professor Tambu is right in front.
Anne, I think I was the only person to teach a creative writing course in the university. And what hurt me, and I use the word hurt, is that before we started the course, I had gone around to ask others who would take over. And there were commitments. And after about 4 years, and when you teach creative writing, especially if you teach poetry, you're giving away your lines, you know. You have to remember that, giving away your lines. And so your own writing suffers. But when the time came, I asked them to take over. They said, oh, well, they gave all sorts of reasons why they couldn't do it. And this is why it didn't go on. I think in the end, what course you offer depends on the teachers you have. Because in creative writing, especially in poetry, a lot depends on the individual, on the teacher. So it depends, really. And I believe we should really get people from within the country to teach the course rather than people from outside. That doesn't answer your question, really, because we had a number. Pity Robbie is not here, because we had a discussion with one family who had promised to provide the funds for a professorship, and I was asked to go to the dinner, and the people with the money wanted something quite different. They didn't know what was needed, but they thought they knew what was needed, and the whole thing ended up with nothing. I'm not, you can't answer that question, really. You've got to see what the realities are. And it depends on the person you put in charge, and the kind of sharing that person has with the other people. And at that time when I was teaching this course, we had at least, how many? 3 other poets in the department. So in the end, it depends on the person. And it's really sad, because when we started this way back before any of the other universities, there weren't other universities, let's not forget that. When we were teaching, we just had 2 universities. And then we ended up with only 1. And then you had the other universities coming in. So there's no answer to that, really. It depends on the people you have. And the number of courses that are being offered all over the place now, I wonder what sort of teaching goes on.
We won't end on this rather down note. We have one last question, but maybe I ask you to make it a quick one so that everybody can have some refreshments.
This question is for Gwee and for Robin. Thanks for the overview of Singlit. I just want to ask you, as of 2019, what's your appraisal of Singapore poetry and fiction in your case? And in your case, theatre. You didn't really go to the very recent and diagnose the health of these scenes, and vis-a-vis the critical literature, because there's very little criticism written in the papers and aside from people like you. So can you diagnose 2019 Singlit?
Who's going to do it first? Well, it's only September, so there's still 3 more months in 2019. So I'm not being flippant. I think I'm going to answer the other question first. And I think the status of, I don't think there is a pragmatic demand for people who just research in Singapore literature. I think it's a practical reality. I don't think you can get a job if you have a PhD in that. In terms of that is a reality, and that has stopped many people from researching in it, and a lot of people from talking about it. That's one. I can't really tell you what the diagnostics here in Singapore, simply because, unfortunately, in Singapore, we don't have a vibrant and active theatre critic culture. We don't. Our newspaper tries, right? So we don't, and we don't have enough avenues to have them published, and there isn't that loop that happens. So these are the critical issues that I'm telling you. So I can't really tell you what the diagnostic is right now, apart from the fact that the year's not over, but these are the impediments I can tell you that we are facing. In just the lack of criticism and good criticism. I'm hoping that will change, and also just lack of any kind of motivation for anybody to pursue a career researching in Singapore theatre or Singapore literature. Gwee?
I agree with Robin on the need of for more criticism, even for Singaporean literature in poetry and prose. you asked me to look at 2019 literature. I mean, I have not read all of them, or even half of them. I need to take time. I'm still catching up with last 2 years. And that's how much production has been going on. That's one. And secondly, also, my point is also to highlight that it's not just about one language. It also has to be, I have to be conscious about what's going on in the other traditions. And so I really cannot speak definitively. What I can say that that is of concern for me is that we have left the role of criticism to the press. The one that I'm really, really very anxious about, because not that I doubt that they're doing the good work, but I question what the reason to highlight certain people over others are. And that's quite much of a concern, because it seems often that they highlight people who win prizes, they highlight people who get international press, they talk about their celebrity status, they don't critically analyze the text or deal with the issues in the text. They go for the controversies, they go for reactions from government, reactions from overseas markets and all that kind of stuff. They don't critically engage the text. And that's the one, all this substitutes for actual engagement. This is the state, I think, of literature 2019, at least in the English sector. I know in the Chinese language sector, it is similar but different, because they have a long culture of the press and the literature engaging each other. So that's, in that sense, that it's healthier. Whereas over here, it's awkward, because there is at least in English side. I really worry for a lot of the young writers, whether they are able to write without having to think about what the text or the press print thinks. That's one. And second, also, there's a tendency not to want to give negative comments, not to give negative criticism. Now, not to say that negative criticisms are necessarily always bad for the soul. I think always, for myself, it's pretty good, to put us in a place, to keep us human, and also recognizing there's room for improvement. But all these are different. We seem to, on one hand, trying to go around not talking about the real issue. On the other hand, we go about collecting comments from all sorts of other places, or from all sorts of other ideas, or objects, in order to not deal with the content of a story or a poem. When can we start to see on a popular platform an analysis of the traditions of poetry in Singapore, talking about that in real literary terms, not saying, oh, this person has done this in the past, this person has won this award in the past, this person was originally a civil servant. Yeah, but what's the work about? We give a very wrong sense about what literature means. We give the sense that it's about achieving celebrity, achieving fame, making money, winning awards. Those are wrong signals. They are, once again, we are feeding the next generation with the wrong ideas of what doing literature is about.
Okay. Yes, please clap for all our three speakers, of course.